Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Educator Yarns. This is episode 10 of season 4. So I'm Jess James from Koori Curriculum and I'm here with my co-host Belinda.
Hi everyone.
Who's from Freshwater Education. And today we're going to be yarning about outcome 4 of the early years learning framework. Children are confident and involved learners, and the embedding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives throughout it. But before we jump in, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all gathered on today and pay my respects to elders both past and present, as well as acknowledging any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander listeners that are tuning into our session today. Thanks everyone for being here and welcome to another episode. So to kick things off, 4.1, which is what we're calling it anyway, which is on page 51, says that children develop a growth mindset and learning dispositions such as curiosity, cooperation, confidence, creativity, commitment, enthusiasm, persistence, imagination, and reflexivity. This is evident when children, for example, explore diverse ways of knowing, being, and doing in their learning. And that was the first sort of point that jumped out to me as I sort of thought it sort of signals a little bit of Aboriginal pedagogy here, and thinking about Aboriginal children's ways of knowing, being, doing and learning, and how if you are a non-Indigenous educator that this could be very different to your ways of knowing, being and doing and teaching, and the importance of viewing children through a cultural lens and not through a Western developmental theory lens. So we always need to look at curriculum and development in that cultural context when it comes to our kids. So whilst there are lots of different Aboriginal pedagogies, the one that I most commonly use, because it is a Wiradjuri pedagogy, but also where I've been teaching and where I'm living, which is in New South Wales, it's the one that's most widely accepted throughout our state, is the 8 ways of learning. And we run lots of different pedagogy sessions on the 8 ways of learning, programming, planning and pedagogy, I should say. We do it holistically in that sense, that support educators in using the 8 ways. And I know, Belinda, you don't necessarily use the 8 ways explicitly at your school, do you? But it's just things that you would do naturally that we've talked about before, it's the same, but different.
Yeah, I think it's just like, for me, when I think about those kind of ways of knowing, being and doing, I think we also just want to think about that innate knowingness that's embedded within us, if that makes any sense. It's like that we know things and I don't even know how we know them. But it's just because it's been passed on or whatnot.
Yeah, well, it's just, I guess, like the how things were done with you as a child, like from your parents and so on and so forth, that it just gets passed on. It just becomes like normalcy, I suppose. Yeah. Is like so like the one of the 8 ways that sort of jumps out to me is like storytelling and story sharing. Yeah. And it's my preferred way to teach. It's also my preferred way to learn. And this talks about the linking of children's personal experiences to the classroom curriculum, but also understanding different ways of storytelling and story sharing. So through obviously yarning, through dance, through music, through movement, through art, and thinking about how we can teach through those processes with any identified topic of inquiry or interest that would be occurring in your classroom. And when I think about my experiences as a child, you know, we had bedtime stories every night and mum would read us a book, but dad would tell us stories from when he was a little boy. And I think having that oral storytelling that we got from him, there's a real warmth in it that is not the same. I mean, there's a connectedness and a closeness when you read books to your children and they're sitting on your lap as well, but it's very different, that oral storytelling. And sometimes, you know, well, often, because I think some of these stories when he was a little boy were very much so embellished in a lot of instances, but they would always change a little bit, you know. There was you never got the same story twice, you know. And my dad's a great storyteller, and one of his nicknames is Teller, because he's a great storyteller.
I just found out the other day that my dad told us when we were kids that he got bitten by a shark because he has a big scar. And I just found out last year that never happened. You know, these are things that you remember and carry with you, you know, your whole life. But I totally agree. I think, like, my dad's taught me a lot about the bush and and about animals. And these are things that I've carried on with me and that I regularly use into my pedagogy on a daily basis, you know, so that storytelling is so powerful.
Yeah. And I know in the new reconciliation in action from Early Childhood Australia, they've got a diagram in there of pedagogy, which it's like a triangle. And at the bottom of the triangle, there's connecting with country. And on the other side is connecting with community. In the middle is storytelling and story sharing and yarning. And up the top is educators. But I kind of think that connectedness and that relatedness and that place-based pedagogy of connecting with country and connecting with place through relationships with people, I think is really important. So that, you know, linking all of that knowledge back to country. And so in the 8 ways of learning, that is land links and connecting with community, and that is community links in the 8 ways of learning. Then you've obviously got storytelling and story sharing, which we've identified. Some of the other 8 ways of learning is deconstruct, reconstruct. So working from the whole to the small, non-linear, which is sort of analogies and understanding that learning doesn't always occur in a linear way, that sometimes we can talk in circles, or we learn in parallel, or something that's slightly connected, same, but a little bit different. Another one is learning maps. So showing children their learning in a visual timeline is one of the ways that I use learning maps, so they can see the journey that they've been on and they can visualize that process.
I think is good for any child, really.
So, and this is what I mean, once you go through the 8 ways of learning, I know heaps of
100%.
educators that use the 8 ways of learning that have no Aboriginal children at their service, because it's just good practice and pedagogy. Then there's non-verbal learning, so which is kinesthetic and hands-on, so construction, gross motor, music, movement, sensory play, schema play, symbols and images, so all your charts, tables, calendars, artworks, photographs, children's work, samples, but it's also the metaphor for something, so the sound of, touch of, taste of, smell of. These are the 8 ways of learning, right? So if you're wanting to know more about 8 ways and how you can use it holistically in your program, you can jump onto the Koori curriculum website. We do team training. We also have some online courses which you can check out, and we've got the pedagogy learning pathway, which is part of the Koori Curriculum Club. But I think it is important to also identify what pedagogy is not endorsed, but like used in your community. Like for me, there's no like one Aboriginal, like it's just like it's another tool that you have in your tool belt, you know. So it's like there are Steiner people out there are Montessori people out there are Reggio people out there, but really, like, I sort of fancy myself a bit of a bitzer. I take a little bit from everything. And I think that's what makes good practice. And I use those tools when I need to, and I know what they are. So possum skin pedagogy is another one. Up our way on the Central Coast, Dr. Narita Blair does some work on spider webs and liliology, which is good. It's 2-way learning. So some people also will use the 8 ways of learning as a bit of a springboard to then adapt it to their context where they are. So understanding that there are many is really important as well.
And what's the protocols, Jess, around the use of something like the 8 ways?
The 8 ways, like my understanding, which is like from the 8 ways online, is that anybody that is working with Aboriginal children, or children in general, I believe, are able to use the 8 ways of learning. I believe that, and I don't know if it's stated on their website, because they are the custodians of the 8 ways of learning, because it has a little bit of an interesting history, how that all came about around cultural intellectual property, I suppose, if you want to call it that. I think so. There's a bit of a shady past with that development of it, which I won't go into, but I think so you are able to use it. You should do it in an informed way. So don't just, you know, look at the symbols and start sticking, you know, non-verbal on your collage trolley and in your construction area and storytelling symbol in your book area. Like, understanding how it's meant to be used is pretty important. But I
suppose I can check out their website anyway for information about protocols and use of the
check out the 8 ways online. And then I always tell educators that I think the respectful thing to do is to go to their local consultative group. So for us in New South Wales, that's our AECG, so our Aboriginal Education Consultative Groups, and ask if it's a framework that they're happy to be used in their community, or not, and what the alternative may be. So they're the right people. So identifying, doing that work in your community connections list, identifying the key stakeholders and whose job it is to give you that advice and that you can consult. And so and getting their endorsement to be able to use it, I think, is also important, because you can't pick something out of a Wiradjuri country and dump it on dark and young country, you know, because it's different. But it can be used. And I know, for example, Queensland Department of Education, they've put a thing out, they've done consultation, they're happy for it to be used up their way.
Okay.
So there are, Department of Ed have also got some information on that as well. But then, you know, I know like down in Victoria, it was being used down there, but now possum skin pedagogy, which Dr. Sue Atkinson has been developing over the last couple of years, that seems to be really quite strong and more widely embraced, I would say, now, as opposed to the 8 ways of learning in most areas. It just depends. But then, you know, I've been asked by Mob out at Bendigo that way at least, to come down and do some work with them on the 8 ways. So then there are traditional owners and so forth and community in certain areas that are also like, oh yeah, we know about that possum skin pedagogy, but we actually like this for whatever reason that is.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's no blanket approach to any of it, right? Okay. 4.2 is on page 53. And it says here that children develop a range of learning and thinking skills and processes such as problem solving, inquiry, experimentation, hypothesizing, researching, and investigating. And I know we had a little yarn before jumping on this podcast, and for you straight away that jumped out as the STEM, you know, STEM-based learning, and you, I know, are really doing some great work in that STEM space at the moment at your school. Do you want to share a little bit about what you've been doing?
Oh my gosh, I'm really passionate about STEM. It's my favorite subject to teach. I always say, you know, the teachers, we do some collaborating and I say, okay, what topics are you guys doing this term? And they say, oh, so you're going to do HISI. I'm like, no, I want to do science. I love science. Anyway, I think for me, like some of the things that I'm doing, I guess, and I do like very similar experiences when I go out to services as well, just like in a different age appropriate way. I love like learning about, like, kids like love learning about science hands-on. You want to be able to, and if you talk about this particular outcome, you know, it's about hypothesizing, experimentation, inquiry, problem solving. Like that needs to be hands-on in my belief. So, you know, we'll do things like we make humpies, right? So the children have to use resources found in the, you know, first we've done some foundational knowledge around, you know, like what is a humpy, what is it used for, what is it made from, all depending on obviously what resources are locally available, the climate, how long a person needs to stay in it, and the fact that they're traditional Aboriginal housing, right? And so then the children will go around and find different resources in the local area, like within the setting, and come to make their humpy. And we do it in groups, and then they have to like problem solve and investigate, like how's it going to stand up? You know, how wide does it need to be? Is this resource going to be windproof? Is it going to be rainproof? All that sort of stuff. And then so they develop their hypothesis, and then we actually investigate to see whether their hypothesis was correct or not. So we do like a wind test of where we just shake a giant piece of cardboard and see if it, you know, and then we get like a water sprayer, and then we like spray water on top of it and see how it pans out. And they love it. And I think it's just such a great hands-on experience. And then we talk after that about making sure that the resources that we take, we return them back to where we got them, as in that like cultural way of how we would do that. I also really love investigating fish traps, because I think fish traps are such a great STEM activity, but also a really important part of Aboriginal culture and technology. So we'll be like, again, like having that investigation into what fish traps are, but then like hypothesizing how fish trap would work, also learning about like Aboriginal cultural ways of like, you know, you're not taking too much, you don't take more than you need, you're not going to take pregnant fish, like all that jazz that's important for us, like cultural beliefs wise. And then we actually make fish traps, and then make a little plug so that the water can come out and see how many fish they caught. And because like I just really do it. Have you ever made fish traps, Jess? Like toy fish traps?
I've made a fish trap using a tomato crawler. Is about the
What's
extent.
a tomato crawler?
Well, it's like that cone. It's like, you know, so you get them from Bunnings, and it's a wire cone shape, I guess is the best way to explain it, which is the shape that a lot of our fish traps are.
Oh,
So
okay,
I
like an
use,
eel trap or something, yeah?
yeah, different to an eel trap because that's sort of got that long snake
Okay,
like bit that goes down, but just sort of like, like a cone, like an upside down, like
okay,
ice cream cone sort of thing, but bigger.
yeah,
And yeah, then I use that as the frame, and then I've used, like, depends if I've never used it like actually to fish with, but I've done it just for play with and to do weaving with children. So we've done it with t-shirt yarn, we've done it with raffia yarn, we've also tried it with lamandra as well to weave around the outside to get that same shape out of it.
yeah.
And yeah, it's a fun thing to do. I've enjoyed doing it.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's so much learning. There's volume, there's measurement, there's like there's just so many science of those foundational skills that as a part of the science curriculum as well.
Have you been able to ever go down to a river or stream and have a go at actually doing it?
Yeah,
You
we
do it? Yeah.
always like when we used to live up north at Broom's Head, like on my partner's, he's a traditional owner up there in Yagle country, and we always there's heaps of like there's like a Broom's Head's like a saltwater place, but it goes into fresh water, I guess, and so there's like all these little streams or like I don't know where there's when the low tide and the fish get caught, but there's heaps of little baby fish, and so we make fish traps to trap the baby fish and catch them for bait.
Oh,
So we
okay.
do
Yeah.
that quite a lot, actually. But I mean, I guess that's not following the principle about keeping really small fish, but we're just taking what we need for bait.
Yeah. But what about with the school? Have they ever had the chance to?
Oh, no, sorry. No, not with the school. Certainly it'd be something I'd love to do, but we just haven't, I guess
Yeah.
we just haven't done it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because there are, like, I mean, like we've done a lesson plan for our Koori curriculum club members previously on, like, on fishing techniques. So like using, like, I can't remember the type of leaf, like the type of leaf that the fish eat, and then it paralyzes them. They go to
The
sleep and they
poison
float
plant?
to
Yeah.
the top, and you can collect them. Or then looking at like the Gaimea spear lilies, which is down on Darawal country, or that's where it's originally from, and then it's everywhere now. And how, spears were made from that, and, fishing spears and like shell hooks and grinding down shells to make a shell hook on grinding
Yeah.
stones with children. We've done things like that before. Obviously, like the making fish traps out of using tomato crawlers as a frame we've done. And a girlfriend of mine, they're on Darug country, and they go to the Barramutta Eel Festival that Murrumbidgee, the Darug Cultural Centre, help facilitate annually. So Parramatta is on Darug country. So Parramatta, Barramutta, Parramatta Eels, see, comes back to the football, doesn't it?
Always.
So and I'm pretty sure they met Uncle out there, and he was talking to them about, taught them how to make an eel trap and how it has to be woven from the grasses and reeds from that river or stream. Otherwise, the eels know that it's foreign and won't swim inside.
Yeah,
So
okay.
then they've come back to the service and they've made, eel traps out of raffia and so forth that they've been able to put in play. And their service is on the river. So it's very contextualized to where they are, and they can see the eels in the river, and they've looked at the important role of eels in being able to clean that ecosystem. So this is Concord West Roads Preschool. So shout out to Marnie and Joe. You can follow them on Facebook if you're keen to see some of the awesome stuff that they do and working with the seasons. And then they also invited Uncle to come to their service and do an eel cook up with children, and they did that with children and families, and so showing that reciprocity. And they've also asked permission to be able to cook the eel in the way that it was shown to them ongoing, and so there's lots of good stuff in there that they can share as well, and they have shared in our
That's
group
amazing.
previously around community involvement, and that sort of comes into 4.2, which is on 53. It says children and confident involved learners, and they develop a range of learning and thinking skills and processes such as problem solving, inquiring, experimentation, hypothesizing, researching, and investigating. Oh, did we just do that one? Oh no, we are doing this one, sorry. And one of the points were here was to connect with their local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, elders, role models, to engage with stories about place-based history and culture. So that's what really made me think about the educators at Concord West Roads Preschool and the work that they've done. I'm pretty sure it's with Uncle Fred, but I could be very wrong. And that place-based knowledge, but they've also looked at things there previously on like scar trees that are along the river, and understood, that making boats from the trees and taking shields and coolamons from the trees and spirits living on in the trees. And they've connected with local artist Leanne Tobin, who's also a children's book illustrator, and she's got some beautiful paintings of tree spirits and so forth that they've been able to draw upon so they've connecting that stem, looking at tools and weapons and so forth, but then also looking at place-based knowledge because they've got scar trees on their doorstep and that connection that's there, as well as then linking that back to arts practice and all that localized learning and pedagogy, which I think is so important. So I always think of them when I think of stuff like this. But one of the things I know that we've talked about this a little bit before, and it says educators promote this learning for all children when they provide opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander educators to provide feedback and reflect on everyday practices within their setting. I just want to know, like, I know that we talked about this before, how like you've gone in and you've mentored Aboriginal educators that may be the lone Aboriginal educator at an early learning service and sort of ask them how they're feeling. Are they happy? And being like that mediator if needed, or just an advocate or a support person for them to be able to voice whatever they need to about their program and practice. But is there any other way that you think Aboriginal educators, or a process that would work for Aboriginal educators to be able to give that feedback in a more streamlined way? Like I'm thinking, because like you might have like a long daycare service, some long daycare services have like 4 or 5 rooms. You might have an Aboriginal educator that's working there, that's working in one classroom. How could a service really facilitate that pragmatically for them to be able to give feedback and reflect on everyday practices and curriculum within a setting, across all these age groups and teams of educators? And then I also just sort of worry sometimes that puts added responsibility sometimes on the Aboriginal educator.
And not even just added responsibility, but potentially some like cultural unsafeness.
Yeah.
Unsafeness, is that a word?
Yeah, well, yeah, I reckon.
We'll go with that. But
yeah, let's go with it.
I don't know, Jess. Like, I think it's a really great question. I mean, it's in there. We want to know how it's done. But one place I have seen it work well is that I am noticing that different organizations, like a Good Start Early Learning or, Good Start Early Learning is the one that I'm thinking of. They actually have a network of Aboriginal educators within their services. So they actually meet on a regular basis as a network. And
I've seen that.
Yeah, then then it's like all Aboriginal voices coming together, and as we know, like feeling a bit more confident and probably comfortable to share their thoughts about practice or whatever it might be. And then they feed back, from what I understand, they then feed that information back to the services about what, but I guess, again, that's not at a service level, that's at a whole, well, it is, but it's obviously like reflective of different services. I can't really think, I'd be open to hear if you've got any suggestions, because I can't really think of a way, unless you had like a structured mentoring program or something.
That's been my experience, right, as a mentoring program. I've also worked like personally as an educator at a council service, and this was when like I was young, like I was just 20, if that, when I was working at council, and they had I think there were 3 Aboriginal educators that were employed across the council services, of which there were 5 or 6. 2 of them were at one service. One was an elder. The other was maybe just a year or 2 older than me. So we were both young, but they were both together and I was on my own. And so one of the things that I was asking for back then was opportunities to bring us physically together so that we could connect and support each other. And that sort of happened, but more, I guess, informally, because we just made it happen. Whereas I kind of thought that should have been made available to us. And back then it was me sort of advocating that I wanted to, I was a bit, I'm like that, but me sort of advocating that I wanted certain things. So there was like an Aboriginal liaison officer that was working with council at the time that I thought that us as Aboriginal educators should have a relationship with.
Yeah.
I just sort of thought, like, looking back on it, that just should have been a given, that, or even across council, like even if it wasn't just us Aboriginal educators, but Aboriginal employees across council potentially should have been given opportunities to come together, maybe. So we could, benefit from those relationships within our organization, within our service. But mentoring seems to work well. Me being the mentor now, mentoring Aboriginal educators, I think that works well. The other thing that I sort of would point out is that what works well for one is good for all. So whilst this is in the scope of allowing Aboriginal educators a voice to give feedback on curriculum and practices and so forth, there's nothing wrong as a director or manager or ed leader, as we've sort of said previously, in relation to working with Aboriginal families or families in general, to just have a cup of tea and a yarn, but making sure that happens periodically and not just informal, because sometimes we all have those informal conversations on the fly, but then also having, times, whether with your team, it's monthly or bi-monthly, quarterly, whatever kind of roster you want to put to it, where there's an opportunity to, whether it's to have lunch together or to go out of the service together and just sit down and just have a yarn about, and there could be a couple of things that you want to talk about, how you're feeling about, relationships within the service, how are you feeling about, the pedagogy and practice, how are you feeling about the reconciliation program, whatever. You could put a few things to it. It doesn't all just have to be in regards to Aboriginal programs, but I would do that with all educators, not necessarily just the Aboriginal educators, because I think it's good practice and it's a good thing to do, same way that we sort of said, to have a cuppa and a yarn with Aboriginal families. Whilst I think that's really important to building that that cultural safety and that way of thinking, I also just think it's a good thing to do for all of your families, right? Not just the Aboriginal ones. So I think that it's just good practice.
But I think that, that depends on the relationship that you've got with your staff as well as the director. Yeah,
and if you don't have that relationship, it's something that you need to fix. You need to fix it, because you need to be accessible. And I think whilst you want to have an open door policy where your educators can come and talk to you as they need to, I think being proactive instead of reactive, where you're not just having these conversations when something occurs that needs seeing to, is important. That you can just go and have some really exciting conversations or inspiring conversations, or just a touch base and a check-in, and making yourself available in that way. And I think it's good for everybody's emotional and mental well-being, and it makes for a good place of employment and community that educators spend a great deal of their lives in working, more time there than what they do with their own families for a lot. So as a manager or director or educational leader, I think it's important that you really put practices in place that help you to build those relationships and connections with all of your staff, so that they do feel comfortable giving feedback and speaking up. I don't know what we're up to now, but it's on page 56. Children resource their own learning through connecting with people, place technologies, natural and processed materials. And so one of the points that I highlighted here was create and construct artwork in a sustainable way using natural and manufactured materials and tools, drawing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories, history, culture, customs, and celebrations. I think that's a big one. I think that's huge. I think it's
broken down.
Yeah, I feel. So I guess creating artwork in a sustainable way, what comes to mind for me is we always talk about not take, make and wasting. So not buying pom-poms and pipe cleaners and cellophane and glitter, but obviously reusing recycled materials. And I think that links into your sustainability principles, but also borrow, using and returning items from country. And I know obviously within scope, you've already talked about in previous episodes about not taking shells from beaches and rocks and that kind of thing from country. So within scope, like fallen leaves and seed pods or things like that children could use potentially in collage or in heuristic play, and then it's returned back once they're finished with. So drawing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories, history, culture, customs and celebrations, gosh, that's just a lot. I mean, so whether or not you look at, traditional forms of art like weaving, whether you look at how that art is created. So instead of, painting at an easel individually, having a roll of paper on the ground and encouraging children to collaboratively sit together and revisit that same canvas or piece of artwork over a period of time, where you're telling a story or, finding ways that you can retell stories. I feel like art is one of the biggest questions that we get from educators. It used to be about dot painting, can or can't we do dot painting? But I think there's more to it than that. So I tend not to answer the questions like whether educators can or they can't do something. To me, it's about the process, why they're doing it and how they're doing it, not so much what they're doing. It's the why and the how. I think that's more important. So the person that I refer to a lot is Kylie Neagle. I thought she was Aboriginal for some reason, but she's not. She's not Indigenous. She works at the South Australian Art Gallery, and she's written a book. It's called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art in the Classroom. And there's 2 editions of it now, some really great examples of practice within there. But she follows this process. So identifying the work of art, the story that's being told, how it relates to the world of your students or children in the classroom, and then how you can take inspiration from that, or how you can respond to the artist's work without creating copies of it. And I think that's a really good process to stay true to, because when we think about, well, what is the work of art? What are the key concepts behind it? So quite often, like, we'll just look at a dot painting, you know, by a Papunya artist, you know, and educators have no idea what the story is being told, or what the art history is of the dot painting movement or anything like that. So I think it starts with understanding key concepts. So where is Papunya? What story is being told here, that it's being told topographically, that it's a map of community, that it's about the seasons in community, that it's certain colours are symbolic of certain things, and who made it, what's their story. So those are key concepts that we can draw out of an artwork that then gives you pause to sort of say, well, how does that relate to the world of your students? So whilst they don't live at Papunya per se, that perhaps that they're looking at maps of community and houses, or maybe, you know, you're exploring seasons at your place. There might not be the same seasons that are in the artwork, but there are synergies there that you can draw from, that you could find those connecting pieces, right? So I think having a clear process helps us understand how to respond respectfully and plan for respectful art practices in our services.
Yeah, and I think educators do need to go a little bit deeper, like you're saying, Jess. There is it is the biggest question, like, what do we do about art? And I think, like, I do encourage educators that are just beginning that journey to reach out to Koori curriculum or freshwater education and engage in some professional development around that, because it is so much more than dot painting. Like, there's so much to it that we can't describe in the 5 minutes remaining of this podcast, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's it as well, is that, so like, it is one of those things that I think there has to be professional development around, and it's like, and I think sometimes that annoys people because I get a lot of emails from educators saying, is it okay for me to do this? Is it okay for me to do that? And I never tell them yes or no, because it's not for me to determine whether it's okay or not okay, because there's so many different contingencies and contexts and whatever. What I will say is, come and do some professional learning on art or on storytelling and story sharing or on Aboriginal pedagogy, so you can determine whether it's okay or not for yourself. Otherwise, you're always going to be asking, you're never going to be knowing.
100%.
So I think it really does start with you building your cultural capacity and understanding, and that's really key here. So was there anything else that you wanted to touch on here? I mean, there was one other that I sort of had, which was educators promote this learning for all children. They, for example, create opportunities to discuss with colleagues the diverse ways of embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives into everyday practices. And for me, what jumps out here is like the benefit of team training, like, and having a intentional time to sort of sit there and review your current programming and planning practices and say, well, this is what we're doing. Where is there space to improve upon? And then reflecting back and seeing how that went at a later date, but also having someone to have those conversations and help mediate that and inspire that discussion. Having everyone together, I think, really helps a lot of the time. And I know this is my experience as an educator. Like, I would be sent off to a conference or to a workshop, and I would get the training, and then I would have to come back and find a way to share that with everybody else. And I still was in the place of being a learner, not a teacher. And then when they would have questions, I didn't know the answer. So I could only take them so far, and they couldn't, you know. So I think it's like having those bigger hands that are able to support you a little bit, but bringing everybody together where you're not at a staff meeting that's also about housekeeping and 10 other things on the agenda, but that is just dedicated just to this, where you can really spend some time having some pedagogical discussions and debates with your team.
And it seems like the fact that you know, that Aboriginal perspectives is so embedded throughout the new version 2 of EYLF. and the fact that it has its own principle now, like I think we need to be able to take that seriously, to say like this, and not to mention within the Department of Education, Aboriginal education is one of the key priority areas. So we have to be able to privilege time for that if we are going to adhere to what we're supposed to be adhering to.
Yeah, for sure. And well, I mean, like as of February, we were all needed to be working with a new version of the early years learning framework. And it's massive. It is huge. And so if you were struggling to do Aboriginal programs before this new version, you would be really, you know, treading water now, I would feel, because it is hard. There is a lot and it is overwhelming. And I think that's all really valid. And I also feel there's not the same amount of supports with the release of this framework as what there was with the original. Like we had the EYLF in practice before, where it was like they would give you examples of how do you do this stuff. There's none of that, which is why we've sort of developed this podcast, right? To give people some ideas of how they could put some of this into practice. Because you don't know what you don't know. And there was also funding to support educators in getting professional development to support them in becoming current with some of these, you know, these actions. And
is that something we can find out, Jess, if there is such a thing, or do we just know that there's not?
There's some funding that's around, but it's not specific for, like, it's not because of this. There's like the Start Strong funding, there's the Kindy Uplift funding, there's the Innovative Solutions funding. Not everybody's eligible for it. Some of it is a lot of it is state specific and region specific, or it's preschool or it's long daycare. I mean, a lot of people have to find community grants and funding. A lot of not-for-profit preschools do that. I know in New South Wales with the preschools that I'm working with, a lot of that is from the Start Strong funding. In Queensland, a lot of the services I work with, it's through the Kindy Uplift funding. But that's, I mean, I mainly work along the East Coast. So that's the main funding that I'm aware of. If you're aware of different streams of funding, you know, by all means, send our podcast a message and we'll share it out there, because we're such an underfunded profession that I think it's needed. But I also do think that organisations and companies, particularly those of the private sector, they need to make this a budgeted item in their annual budgets for educators to get some professional development to support them to do 100%. This work. Not just in building their professional development, but actually also in the implementation. Because I remember, and I might be wrong, with the old funding that came out with the first release of the early years learning framework, you could use it on PD funding, like for PD workshops, right? But say if you did one on art and to implement it, you needed to buy art materials, you could then use that funding to buy the art materials that you needed to implement the training that you've just done. So I think that's how a lot of people got smart screens and stuff, because they did some, you know, training on like the use of smart screens. And they could put forward a case to then use some of the funding to get some smart boards and stuff in their services. But I think it's all really valid, right? Because it's all right for us to say, right, okay, well, this is how you go ahead and make community links. But unless you've got some funding to be able to engage an elder or artist in residence, or to release an educator off the floor to go and do that, you have to have the tool to be able to implement it too. And some of it does come down to having some funding in your budget. And also 100%. Giving educators the autonomy and agency to use that funding, that it's not so convoluted that every time they're out in community and they see a really good book or a great CD or a great toy or resource, that they have to go back and get a purchase order and ask for permission to go ahead and buy it off the community person who's not set up with a website yet and whatever, and the opportunity is lost and gone, or they have to go into their own pocket to pay for things. So I think, you know, having systems in place where educators have the freedom to be able to action, and trusting your educators know what they need, and that they're not silly people, that we understand what's a good tool and resource when we see one. So I mean, those are some things for sure that I think need to be considered in the rolling
Absolutely.
out.
Absolutely. There was only one other area that I thought would be relevant. I mean, there's lots of other areas of the outcome 4, but retell or create simple stories using materials or drama to represent ideas. And for me, what that links me to, I love telling stories through sand. Is that something that you ever do, Jess?
Yeah, I do. Particularly like with storytelling and story sharing, when I'm looking at 8 ways of learning in my planning, I do that. But it doesn't always have to be Aboriginal stories, and it doesn't always have to be Aboriginal symbols that we're using. So just mark making in general as we're telling a story to illustrate something or to emphasize something, as a different way to bring children in, and supporting children to create and share their own stories in that way. We do that too. And then I think taking contemporary perspectives on that. So sand is something that I've always done and I love to do, but recently I've been doing some contemporary stuff using calligraphy paper, because it's that same idea that it's transient. It's that impermanent. So it's a really good storytelling tool to use.
Yeah, awesome. I love, you know, when I'm doing a sand story kind of experience, because we do like cultural incursions at Freshwater Education as well. And so part of that would be about story sharing. And so I do things like, you know, sharing a story through sand, but it could be something like the Three Little Pigs, you know, but we're still using, I'm talking and yarning with the children about this is how our old people will share stories. This is how it's been done for thousands of years. I might incorporate some Aboriginal symbols in my story, or I might not. But part of that element is still a cultural perspective, because the way that our people tell stories, one of the ways, is through sand. So that, like you said, I don't think we have to box ourselves into, like, a learning experience doesn't have to, like, the Aboriginal perspective doesn't have to be that entire experience, does it? It can be elements of that experience that can have that Aboriginal perspective, but we can also, like you said, contemporize. That's, I'm making words up.
Yeah. Sure. We're doing great.
Or I'm just going to make it believable, but certainly to make it have that, you know, to have that, and to make it culturally responsive. Like, you know, we were doing stories about how the kids got to, how they got to their early learning service that day, you know, but we're using symbols of, here's the footprints, and let's use this symbol as being the school and whatnot. So, you know, one of my education mentors, and I'm sure he won't mind me using his name. His name is Dr. Michael Donovan from Goombanga country, and he says to me, not to me, but one of his sayings is that Aboriginal pedagogy is good for all children, but not all pedagogy is good for Aboriginal children.
Yes. So I love that. That's so good. That's very
amazing.
powerful.
He's shout out to Mickey D, who's at I think at Macquarie Uni now, but I think it's so important. Like, all of these things that work for our kids are working for all kids, you know?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Oh, that's really powerful. That's really powerful. What a great saying. And that just sort of hits the nail on the head, I think. Exactly that. And I like what you're saying as well. Like, it doesn't have to be a whole Aboriginal experience. And that's exactly not what we want, right? So, I mean, like we say, it's multifaceted. So you have your inclusive play spaces, you include in children's interests, you use Aboriginal pedagogy, and you teach directly about culture. So you use all four of those things at different times and in different places, in different contexts that you need to. So if you're out on country, you might be teaching directly about culture. Like, this is how our people use fish traps to catch fish. That's a direct teaching of the culture. But, you know, the children might have an interest in under the sea, and you might have a sea small world play area set up, and you might just add a woven fish trap into that, you know, and it's just one part of a bigger bigger thing, you know what I mean? And that's the idea, is that it's about our culture being considered and included everywhere all the time. But it's not about taking something and morphing it into an Aboriginal agenda that's being shoved down children's throats. It's not that, you know, it's about our kids being able to see themselves and our culture reflected everywhere, and not being boxed in to NAIDOC week and reconciliation week and boomerangs and didgeridoos. Like, yes, that those are the parts of our culture that we know that our kids love, but there's more to being Aboriginal than that.
Absolutely.
And that's where the learning sometimes has to come from educators, is understanding what does it mean to be Aboriginal today, the different ways that we identify that our identity is a unique thing to each of us. And that's why cultural learning plans are so important. So listening back to some of those previous episodes, which we'll link in the show notes for you if you've missed them, where we've talked about the benefit of cultural learning plans, and how you can be and should be using them in your service. For anyone that's interested, I know that Belinda has her cultural learning plan that she has as a template at Freshwater Education, which you can download, which we've talked about previously. And in some of our live webinars that we have coming up at Koori Curriculum, one of them is understanding the EYLF principle, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. We also take you through a cultural learning plan and how that then speaks to and influences an 8 ways of learning plan, and a programming document, which we take you through. So if you're wanting to see how all 3 of those things fit together, that would be an opportunity for you guys to come check that out. All right. Look at that. We've filled up another episode. We've made it. Thanks everyone for tuning in. The next session that we have together, obviously we'll be looking at outcome 5, children are effective communicators. If you have any specific questions about outcome 5 that you'd like us to yarn about and answer in that upcoming episode, then please reach out to Belinda at Freshwater Education or to myself at Koori Curriculum. And we'll be sure to try and take that into consideration when we're having our yarns and give you some ideas of what you can do. We would love if you could share our podcast with educators within your network. It's one of the ways that you can show that reciprocity back to us and help amplify our voices within your sphere of influence. We would really appreciate that. And if you have time to leave us a review, that also makes us discoverable on podcasting platforms to other educators. And we would love to read some of your reviews if you're able to leave it directly on to wherever it is that you're listening. We would love that. So thanks, Belinda, for joining me for another episode, and I'll yarn again with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. Stay deadly, everyone.